Okay, we are in the second shir of Hilchos Pesach. We're finishing off Siman Kuf Zayin, the halachos of Shabbos Hagadol. So now we say like this: Siv Gimel b'Shabbos Hagadol lemincha. When it comes to mincha, the afternoon on Shabbos Hagadol, noigin she'inem in Baruch Nafshi ela avadim b'yinu. There's a minute we don't say Baruch Nafshi, which I guess we don't really do anyways. Instead, we do say avadim hayinu, and this would be, by the way, even if it's erev Purim. Yeah, in the I'm sorry, erev Pesach. So even though you're about to repeat the whole Haggadah, then you do it anyways. And in the Dalit over there, it says ad lechaper al kol avenesenu, until you come to the part where it says lechaper al kol avenesenu. That's what we do, because people have different minhagim. So over here, it's spelled out explicitly what our particular minig would be. Now, okay, leave that for now. Okay, now the fee. Why do we do this? From Shabbos Hagadol already started the different nisim that were supposed to happen. Now, obviously, everyone knows Shabbos Hagadol, or I think everyone kind of knows. So, a few things that happened. Number one, they started to prepare the animals that they would be using for the Korban Pesach. So that's number one, and that they would bring in from Yud. Okay. That they would bring in from Yud Nisan already, and that year it was on a Shabbos. They also the war with the Bechayrim happened then as well, because when they came in to talk to the Yidden, to Pare, and they asked why do you have what do you call it? Why do you have the animals? And they told them they went to war because they weren't. It's gonna be Makas Bechayres, so they went to war. So the whole thing happened then. Now technically, it happened on a day of the month. It didn't happen on a day of the week per se. You're celebrating it on Shabbos Hagadol as Shabbos, but during the month that falls in at all different times. So obviously there's a difference between the day of the month and the day of the week. So why are we choosing the day of the week? The reason why we choose the day of the week is like this. Yud Nisan is also the day that Miriam passed away. Now, in general, when Miriam passes, when it's Tzaddik or Tzaddik passes away, there's a kapara that happens already as is. So, for example, we know on Rosh Hashanah, we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Why not? Because the day itself accomplishes what it's supposed to do. If it's Shabbos, you don't blow it shofar on Shabbos, Rosh Hashanah. And the reason is because really Shabbos does it by itself. You don't also need to have another thing to do the same thing. Shabbos accomplishes it on its own. So too the Misa of a Tzaddik also accomplishes what it needs to. And therefore, that day itself, we don't have a need to celebrate as the big day of Nisim. So we switch it over to Shabbos Hagadol, to the Shabbos before. Sometimes it's a day before, sometimes it's a few days before, but that's the way that we do it in this Indian. Yeah.
Say that Shabbos is for copper and the part.
1 second.
Right? You're saying the Shabbos accomplishes what Rosh Hashanah does, which is copper.
Yeah.
And Shabbos is like copper.
For Rosh Hashanah, it's something that's mechaper so much. The idea of whatever, let's leave it for now, because it's really Rosh Hashanah Indian. That's not the point. The point is that we're not losing anything by not blowing shofar in Rosh Hashanah. Okay, let's leave that for now. The point is, when it comes to Pesach and you're trying to remember the Nisim and start celebrating, so in Indian, Shabbos itself is already a day of Kedusha, it's already a day of Lamai L'miteva, so you don't have to then go and also have another celebration commemorating Shabbos Hagadol or whatever, the day of the Nisim. It kind of happens on its own, so therefore we do it a different day. Fine, moving along to Siman Kuf Ches. This is the Dine Achitin V'Akemach L'matzos. Here we're talking about the halachos of the wheat and the grain that you use for the matzah. Sif Aleph. Ksiv Ushmartem es hamatzos. It says in the Torah that you need to guard the matzos. Now, what does it mean to guard the matzos? So technically it could mean make sure you have matzahs for Pesach. That's on a basic level, that's what it means. Right? Guard could also mean like shamar, to guard Shabbos. It just means to comply. But mikan shetzrichim lishmar es achitim l'shem matzos mitzvah. But from here comes the halacha that you actually have a requirement to guard the grains that you're going to use for the matzahs mitzvah. Matzahs mitzvah generally means the ones that you have for the Seder. There are some who extend this and they say that it goes to all matzahs for the whole Pesach. We'll see a little bit later. And what are you guarding it from? By the way, the Lashon Shulchan Aruch and the Alter Rebbe says this, is Ein Adam Yetzi Yidei Chivasai Ella B'Matzah Shmura. that you need, the requirement is that it's part of the requirements of how do you make matzah? You use flour or grain that is shmura. So it's not just like an extra thing. Oh, we have matzah shmura. According to a lot of halach, according to a lot of poskim, seemingly you may not be yotze to some degree if you don't have matzah shmura. Now, what are you guarding it from? So obviously, number one, shalayavayu aleihem. The obvious basic thing you're guarding it is that you don't want it to come into contact with water. If the wheat comes into contact with water, and if the flour comes into contact with water, then you have chametz. So that's obviously what we don't want. Now, how does this process work? So ladas ktsas migdei poskim zal. According to the opinion of many great poskim, meaning the Rishonim, tzrichin shmira zu. There's 3 levels or 4 levels, depending on how you divide it, of when you need shmira. So number 1, miyad mishas ktsira ve'elach. Number 1 would be from the time that you harvest the wheat and on. That means as soon as it's cut, from then already it needs to be shomer, it needs to be guarded, that it doesn't come into contact with water. That would be the best or strictest opinion. Aval minhag, but what's the minhag of what we do? Now the minhag is not the halacha either necessarily. The minhag is just what's done. Would be a little bit less. It would be huka poskim. Again, this is not necessarily our minhag. I'm just putting it out here the way it would be like in the core Shulchan Aruch. The minhag would be ka poskim desagilu b'shmira misha shemelichin oisan lichin. The core opinion would be, or the minhag that's accepted, is that we follow the opinions that from the time that you take it to grind. So in other words, when you cut them, they don't have to be as careful. It's more when they bring it into the mill. When they bring it into the mill where they're going to grind it and turn it into flour, so now the flour is what we're concerned about. So from when they start to transport it into the mill, that is the time that we're concerned. Now, that's not how the Alter Rebbe words it. The Alter Rebbe says, Lashon Rabbeinu mishas tchina. Not just when you bring it into the mill, but actually when you start to grind it and turn it into flour. And why is that? Because the way the mills used to work was what's called a water mill. They would build it next to rivers, and the flow of the river would basically, they would have these big, fans, like wind turbine style, that would have buckets, and as the water would go, it would fill it up, and it would turn in a cycle, and it would keep on going. And that's how they would turn the mill, which were these massive stones. Otherwise, how do you do it? We're not talking about a small little one. We're talking about an industrial level. So there was always water around the mills. So because of that, the time that you're bringing it to the mill, that's the first processing, and there's water around. That's the time that you have to be careful. That's the minhag already from there. Okay, now, however, the ikar adin, which means the actual halacha would say, what does it really mean to guard it from when it comes in contact with water? The whole issue is it shouldn't turn into chametz. If it overextends, if it starts to, if it rises too much, right? So as long as it didn't come in direct contact with water, there's no real concern. So the real halacha is from the time that it comes into contact with water, you have whatever it is, 18 minutes, whatever we'll get to later, we'll talk about. But the point is that when it comes in contact with water, one level up would be when you bring it to the mill or when you actually start to grind it, as the Alter Rebbe says. That's the second level. The third level would be from the time that you already cut it from the ground, which is way before any processing. So you have over here basically 3 levels of how this would work. Now, technically, if you have the grain that's dry and nothing happened to it, in theory, you could keep it on Pesach. You could even grind it on Pesach, even if it wasn't shmira till that point, because according to the halacha, we're never concerned. The concern is only when it comes in contact with water. So in Inyan, that's something, we don't do it anymore. We don't do anything on Pesach like we'll see later. But in theory, there's no real concern according to the Ikar halacha till that point. Now, the hamedaktiking, however, those that are very particular about mitzvahs and they try to do it in the right way. So if they're medaktik b'mitzvahs, choshishin l'shmira mishas ktsira, they would say, even though the Ikar halacha is only when you grind it or when you bring it to the mill. And those that want to be a little bit more strict, would say from the time that you need it, the more lenient would say really only from the time that you need it. But there is an opinion that even when you cut it from the ground, already at that point, you're going to be careful. And therefore, for those that are medaktik in mitzvahs, that are particular about doing the mitzvahs properly, they would already start to guard it from the time that it's cut. And this is the proper way to do it. And in the bottom he says, this is taka our minig. And then he adds from the Alter Rebbe, that at least to matzah's mitzvah. But there's two separate statements. Matzah's mitzvah would be the first level. If you don't have a lot of shmura matzah, first level would be matzah mitzvah. But beyond that, the real meaning that he's referring to is that all your matzah throughout the whole Pesach should really be matzahs that were shomer from the time of Kitzur at best, and if not, from a little bit later. But nowadays, I believe basically all flour is basically mishas Kitzur. It's an extra chumrah, but it's not the biggest deal. So apparently, almost every box of matzah you'll get that has a reputable hechsher, they're all going to say mishas Kitzur, right? It'll say matzah shmura mishas Kitzur. So now you know what it means. It means that they're applying the rules of Shemitah earlier in the process, which is a much better level. It's much stricter, I guess you could say. 1 second. 1 second. 1 second. So why does Alter Rebbe say that for the matzah mitzvah, at least that should be the first level of chumrah if you could for the rest, that would be better. But at least for the first one, because there are those who say that the matzah that you use for the Seder needs to be able to have turned into chametz as well. So the only way it could turn into chametz is technically only from when it's in contact with water. So that's why at least for that, but if you could do for the whole thing, that's really our minig in the end of the day. Someone had a question? Yeah. What do you mean?
When I said that, what's the word they use?
Medaktikim mitzvahs?
Yeah, where you see on the box there. Well, no, I think like they're being more from what.
Okay, so again, like there's two different things. There's the levels in matzah, and then there's the level of the person. So the levels of matzah would be either the best level is guarding it from the time that you cut it. The next level would be when you bring it to the mill. The next level would be when you grind it into flour. And the last level would be when you mix the water actually in it and knead it. Those are 4 levels of matzah. Then you have in the person different levels. You could be strict for the matzah's mitzvah, which is during the actual Seder, the 3 that you need for your kaira. And then you have the matzah you have for the rest of Pesach. Now, the matzah mitzvah, so if a person could be machmir and get the best, which would be from the time it's cut for everything, that's the best way to do it. That's v'chei nachal lasais medaktikim b'mitzvah. That's what we try to do. Now, and let's say in communist Russia back in the day or things like that, when they didn't have options like that. So if they couldn't get matzah shmura from the time of Kitzur, they would go with the lesser levels of matzah that they could. And if they could get a little bit of matzah shmura, they would use that at least for the Seder, which is what we call matzah's mitzvah. But again, all of them technically could be kosher for everything if you need it. But in terms of when you can apply which chumrah, nowadays I believe all matzah that you're going to buy, like I said, would probably be from the shas Kitzur, and that's the proper thing to do. Yes.
No, Pesach, if you want to eat matzah.
On Erev Pesach?
No, on the whole Pesach, but I'll make sure it's on.
Oh, you're saying like alachilas matzah?
Yeah.
No, you only do that by the Seder, the first night, second night. Okay, so we'll talk about it later. I don't want to get distracted. Yeah. That wasn't nice of them. Okay. Fine, let's go weiter. Okay. V'ro l'daktik.
Your arm disappeared.
Okay. V'ro l'daktik shelo yamdu hashibolim b'mechuber ad sheyisyavshu kol tzorkon v'yalbinu. Now this is an interesting part. He says that when it comes to the wheat that's growing, if you don't mind, when it comes to the wheat that's growing, there's different stages that you could harvest it, basically. And the appropriate way to harvest it would be, okay, so basically like this. When it comes to the grain that's growing, in theory, as long as it's connected to the ground, there shouldn't be any issue. Why not? Because when it's connected to the ground, it doesn't become chametz. The whole only time that the grains can turn into chametz is when they turn into grains, when they're disconnected from the ground, and then they start to ferment. As long as they're connected to the ground, when they get wet, they just grow. So there'd be no issue. So nevertheless, the halacha is like this. So basically like this, as long as it's officially connected, there's no problem. It's just growing. But the problem is like this. Sometimes something is connected, but it doesn't really need to be connected. So you know when you have a tooth that gets loose. So at a certain point, it's not really connected. It's not really getting life anymore from the body. It's basically a dead tooth that just hasn't felled yet. It's still connected by a little string or whatever. So you twist it off, it comes off, and you move on, right? So the same thing with the wheat. At a certain point, the wheat is no longer growing. It's no longer needing the ground. It's just there because no one plucked it yet. At that point, there is one opinion that says, or a opinion that says, it may already become chametz if it gets wet, and it's not only going to overgrow, it's going to turn into chametz. So therefore, the opinion says like this. Therefore, we paskin that we should be careful to see to it that the stalks are not connected to the ground till they dry completely, right? Till they dry completely. And v'albino, and they become basically white, which means that they're no longer in the process of growing; they're fully ready. Kiaz, because some say in Yerdu Aleim Shamim, at that point, if rain falls on it, Yachmitzu, it will become chametz. Afilu b'mechuber, even if it is connected to the ground. Why? Given she'einam tzrichin oid karka, because they don't need the ground anymore. Alkein rov, and therefore, if it gets wet, even though it's connected, it's not really connected. Therefore, ideally, the wheat should be harvested while it's still a little green before it dries, and then you dry it later in the storehouse in a safe environment where it won't get wet. Now, someone that could get the wheat, as we said before, that's guarded from the time that it was Kitzur, from the time that it's cut. That's the best, which we said we try to do. Or at least for the Seder on the 2 days. The Rebbe Rashab, maybe we'll talk about it another time. The Rebbe Rashab was a whole process of how they would go and harvest the wheat. But one of the Nekudas is that it was done during the day, very particular hours between 12 and 3 when the sun was out and the heat of the day. And this way, they were ensuring that it was as much of a dry atmosphere that it can be to make sure that nothing has any moisture in any way that would be there. That's okay. So that's what comes out from Siv Aleph. You had a question?
Is there sheer for how much water is allowed to be on the matzah or is it?
On the matzah or on the grain?
You put water on the bottom.
Okay, then
That's what I was gonna say, if they.
1 second. Wait, hold on 1 second.